let's get back to Australia now for a moment. So obviously, much of the discussions we have here are about MMT, and they typically tend to stay within the walls of the United States. But Australia is a nation that is monetarily sovereign. Many of the same rules and economic truths exist down under. I believe, many people have got it locked into their brain that when we talk about modern monetary theory, and we should just say modern monetary reality or something so people stop getting fussed around with the T. But the reality is that the same concept of a sovereign, free-floating fiat currency that is in the United States exists in Australia. Perhaps some different man-made rules that control this and that, but largely the same exact parameters. Can you talk to us a little bit about the Australian economy, what makes it unique and what makes it the same?
What makes it unique and what makes it the same? Well, Australia is a more resource-based economy. Obviously the US is a much bigger economy than Australia and a more complex economy than Australia. In terms of Australia's exports, we export a lot of resources, iron ore, coal, and others, to China, India, many other manufacturing countries around the world. But in terms of the financial balances, we're in quite a similar position to the US. Australia has run a deficit with the rest of the world, what's sometimes called a current account deficit, every year since about 1974. So just as the rest of the world wants to net lend to the US or net save in US dollars, the same thing is true for Australia and Australian dollars. So all that stuff you hear people talking about with respect to the US, about the petrodollar, and the US is in a unique position because its currency is used to value resources around the world, or is the central currency as far as the global foreign exchange market is concerned. All that's true of the US dollar. But in terms of modern monetary theory, it's irrelevant because those things are not true of Australia. But Australia has just the same monetary sovereignty as the US. And in many ways, as I said, it's been in the same position. The rest of the world has wanted to net save in our currency, has wanted to net lend or net invest in the Australian economy over time, which means we in Australia have had the option of either having the government inject Australian dollars into the system by running large enough government budget or fiscal deficits to offset the net savings desires of the rest of the world in Australian dollars, or the only alternative for that has been to rely on private debt to do it. And particularly between the mid-1990s and the global financial crisis in Australia, we relied on private debt. The government of the day ran for 8 out of 10 years preceding the Great Recession around the world, ran budget surpluses in Australia. So we had the rest of the world running a surplus in Australian dollars. We had our government irresponsibly running a surplus in Australian dollars. The Australian private sector was forced to run large deficits. Otherwise, our economy would have gone into recession. We did not suffer the worst consequences of the global financial crisis because some of the financial practices that encouraged that crisis in the US had not yet taken root here. We hadn't gone very far down the mortgage securitization route. We didn't have the same type of financial fragility that you had in the US system. But we had just as much household debt as you, and in fact more so. And had the government that we had at the time, it was a Labour government, not run a significant fiscal deficit deliberately in order to support our economy here when the financial crisis spread from the US in 2008 or 2009, we would have had a prolonged and severe recession here. Fortunately, the government at the time, albeit temporarily, was wise enough to run a big enough fiscal deficit to keep Australia out of recession at the time. But a negative consequence of that is that whereas in other countries around the world household debt fell following the financial crisis, partly because of defaults, but also partly because of people being more cautious. In Australia, the government didn't run a big enough fiscal deficit for long enough to allow that to happen. And because we didn't have a major financial crisis here at the time, household debt in Australia is still at record levels now. So we have now in Australia, in many ways, a more fragile financial system than we had in 2005 or 2006. It would take a minor recession in Australia to trigger a property market crash here, because we didn't learn the lessons of 2008, because we didn't suffer the consequences of 2008. But yes, we have the same monetary sovereignty you have, in some ways even a bit more, in that there's for a few years the government did stupidly introduce a US-style debt ceiling here, but they've scrapped it again. There is no debt ceiling here. And whereas in the early 1980s, an informal arrangement was made between our government and our central bank, that the central bank in Australia, the Reserve Bank, doesn't just allow the government to net spend. It doesn't allow the government to run large overdrafts. In Australia, unlike in the US, there's no legislation behind that. So there is nothing to stop the government, if they decided to do so tomorrow, just cancelling the issuance of any new government securities and purely net spending by keystrokes. That could happen here without any legislation taking place, unlike in the US.